Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's SANS webcast. Don't patch, transformative security programs go beyond the vulnerability. My name is Carol Auth of SANS, and I will be moderating today's webcast. Today's featured speaker is Matthew Toussain, an active duty Air Force officer and the founder of Spectrum Information Security. If during the webcast you have any questions for our presenter, please enter them into the questions window located on the GoToWebinar interface at any time. Please note that this webcast is being recorded, and a copy of the slides and recording of this webcast will be available for viewing later today and can be found on the SANS registration page. And with that, I'd like to hand the webcast over to Matthew.
Hello, everyone, and happy holidays to all of you. I hope you've been playing the holiday hack. If not, you really ought to get on that. If you're looking for a reason to start, tomorrow I will be doing a webcast or a live stream of my experiences with it, so you can join me and laugh at my antics. In any case, today what we're talking about is vulnerability assessment. And yes, absolutely, it's a clickbait title. Don't patch, but I'll be completely honest with you. True story. Every time we teach the Sec 460 vulnerability assessment course, day one, and for those of you who are alumni of the course, you may have heard me say this, the first thing I say is don't patch and ignore your vulnerability scanner, which of course seems insane, right? The entire purpose of vulnerability assessment is to do those kinds of things. Well, I hope by the end of this webcast, you'll find that there's a lot more to vulnerability assessment than that, and that many organizations are not only experiencing compromises today by over-reliance on certain tools, but that there's also a better way, and that there's a much more importance to vulnerability assessment than we tend to ascribe. As somebody myself who absolutely adores red teaming, I fall prey to this occasionally, but we ought not to. Just so everyone's aware, when we're talking about different styles of information security, there really is just a broad aspect. But I think one of the things that we, again, tend to overemphasize is that there's a hierarchy here, and there really isn't. There's different focus areas, but there's no hierarchy. And in SANS, we might actually be a bit of a problem seeker here insofar as we rank these things by level of numbers and difficulty and so on. But while that might ascribe to the class itself, it doesn't actually pertain to the difficulty of the service that we're talking about. In my opinion, one of the most important services that exists in cybersecurity today is vulnerability assessment. I'll tell you right off the bat, doing cybersecurity for the Air Force, for Black Hills, CounterHack, Open Security, my own company, we do pen tests, we do red team, but oftentimes that's the name the service gets purchased under. And while we perform that service, once we finish the entire thing in, say, an hour and a half, 2 hours, we realize there's the actual service the organization requires. And most of the time, it's vulnerability assessment. For example, with a penetration test. With a penetration test, we're often talking about actualizing risk and demonstrating some kind of value proposition. That might have some benefits insofar as the organization doesn't understand the risk that they're actually accepting. And so a penetration test proves the reality of it and demonstrates that. That's fantastic. There's some huge value to that. But a pen test exists to tell a story, as in, here's your potential risk that you don't actually believe maybe that you have, or you don't know the paths to that, and a penetration test shows you one of those paths. And if there's still time in your scope, maybe we show a couple more of these paths in order to demonstrate the actualization of that risk. But at the end of the day, has a penetration test showed you all of the vectors? And the answer, of course, for any enterprise is absolutely not. And neither will a vulnerability assessment show you these, but it does exist specifically to provide that additional scaling and tell you more of the entire perspective, the picture, if you will, of what your vulnerability space exists for your organization. And you know, one of the best for vulnerability assessors additional services are? It's penetration tests. Because once we've assessed a certain level of vulnerability space to maybe a condition or a finding that we want to get remediated, there's no better validation control than a penetration test. But these services live together, and they form essentially off of each other's deficiencies. Penetration test is outstanding, and so is vulnerability assessment, and they work together quite well. Now, when we start talking about this, I think the first place, and this maybe seems a bit foundational, but truly the first place that most vulnerability assessment and management programs begin to go wrong is with this understanding of what a vulnerability actually is. And I think this is vital, right? We have this complaint essentially in the industry whenever we're talking about any kind of courseware. It's that why do we have to start talking about terminology from the very beginning? But I think because we don't really want to, it's actually the genesis of a lot of the locations in which we begin to go wrong. For example, is a vulnerability something our vulnerability scanner tells us? Perhaps it's in the name, right? Vulnerability scanners should identify vulnerabilities. I'll tell you right off the bat, doing penetration testing and red teaming, one of the least common things for me to leverage is a vulnerability that's identified by a general purpose vulnerability scanner. It happens, absolutely. Commonly, not really. I would say my entire company this year, we've probably triggered 5 unique vulnerabilities, and we do assessments for Fortune 500, Fortune 50, and all kinds of organizations out there. So how is it that if you were to patch these 5 specific vulnerabilities, we wouldn't have used a single direct exploit for the standard definition of what a vulnerability is on networks, and yet we generally make it to domain admin on most of these environments within a couple hours. I think most of that stems from a misunderstanding of what a vulnerability is. So when we start talking about the concept of a vulnerability, I think it's very important, vital even, to talk about what an attacker may actually do. And so let's go through a couple case studies here that demonstrate this point. For example, Deloitte. Deloitte got compromised. They're also ranked pretty highly by Gartner for a while now. Incidentally, you know what it takes to be the number 1 ranked by Gartner? It's to pay more than number 2 ranked by Gartner, which, to be fair, is a demonstrator of the circumstance in which we live in cybersecurity today. Deloitte received this compromised via uploading their VPN keys to the internet. I'm not kidding. They uploaded their VPN keys to the internet, in addition to their passwords for Mongo databases, proprietary source code that should never have been out there, across the massive entirety of the entire enterprise, over and over and over again. Attackers didn't actually trigger a CVSS score, a CVE, a vulnerability, what we tend to think of as an exploit. But to be fair, they exploited Deloitte by using the gifts that they had given them for free on the internet. And this is really the vulnerability space, because we talk about corporate and organizational risk. How the attacker gets there doesn't really matter, because there's no such thing as cybersecurity risk. There's business risk, and cybersecurity is absolutely a vector to actualize that risk. But that vector may come through multiple different means and avenues, and those avenues are often not something like Spectre and Meltdown. Spectre and Meltdown, cool vulnerabilities? Absolutely, they most assuredly are. However, did you patch them? Maybe, maybe not. Did you have to deal with them and experience them in your environment? The answer is likely yes. You likely had to. Why? Maybe somebody came in and they're on the highly technical side and they're looking at the details in this vulnerability and say, wow, this is really bad. And they're not wrong. It is really bad. It's also really cool how this works and how it can happen. And it's easy to get wrapped around the axle on that. On the management side, though, it's also really interesting because it's on the news and it has these really sweet logos. A logo vulnerability isn't a business risk, though. And in vulnerability assessment, vulnerability management programs, we not only need to realize this, we need to realize the difference between something like Spectre and Meltdown, and conversely, something like the true reality of what happened to Deloitte and what is the real vulnerability space for our organizations at large. So how does a threat actor trigger a vulnerability in order to exploit an organization and achieve their nefarious intent? Essentially, there's 3 different categories of these, and this is also quite interesting if we think about it. For example, the first category, server-side. This is the one we tend to think of most commonly. As an example, Equifax was exploited via a server-side vulnerability in an application that exposed the internet. It was a web server, and that web server could be exploited directly. This was bad. It was truly really bad. But it's also uncommon. Most exploits today fall into the client-side space. The reason for this is that because we may have a couple ports open, a couple services available server side, but on the client side, look at what's in program files x86, app data, Windows, see Windows System 32, and the list goes on. That's a list of the software on the client side. On the client side, we have much more software than we do on the server side, which means there's more attack surface. And most importantly, most client-side attacks don't exploit a vulnerability with a CVE. They exploit features. Microsoft Excel, dynamic document exchange. Microsoft Excel again, macro-enabled documents. Windows itself supports the ability to execute JavaScript via Explorer by itself, default, with a double click and 0 warnings. This isn't a vulnerability in the common parlance. This is just a feature, and it's how Windows works. Attackers leverage this, which means from the client-side perspective, the threat actor exploits a vulnerability that is just a feature, and they achieve their nefarious intent, which gives them access to the system. This means there's no patch for this. After exploiting to the client side and gaining this access, right, off of maybe a user click, which we all kind of acknowledge is going to happen, what do they do next? Oftentimes, it's something called local privilege escalation, or LPE. What's one of the most fascinating things I think of with cybersecurity today is actually LPE. Microsoft has had several local privilege escalation vulnerabilities over the past year. Several. And a fair few of those were not necessarily unique vulnerabilities, so much as they were failures for the patch to appropriately mitigate the vulnerability they thought they were patching. So the attacker simply went around and retooled the exploit to bypass the mitigation, in this case, the mitigation being the patch. One of the biggest reasons why I say don't patch is because we tend to think that a patch is a fix. That's inaccurate. A patch is a mitigation. A good patch is a great mitigation. There are other mitigations like compensating controls. In the case of a web application system, a web application firewall might be a great mitigating control, and it might have been the better solution for something like Equifax, where they were able to look at something like Apache struts and identify that there's a historical proclivity for this framework to become vulnerable, and it's on a system that's really important to us, which means what's if we miss the patch? Let's say today, instead of patching, we implement a compensating control. Tomorrow, when a new vulnerability comes out, does that compensating control also mitigate that, even though we didn't know about this future consideration? And the answer very often is yes. But back to LP. If an attacker uses a client-side feature to gain access to systems, where might the first exploit that they use be? Is it on the server side, or is it to escalate privileges? Well, they've already got access. Now they just want to get elevated access. In the history of Microsoft, there's only ever once been a privilege escalation vulnerability that they have called critical. Once. MS14-068. And in my opinion, it's actually probably the worst vulnerability in the history of Microsoft. It allows privilege escalation from the domain user level to the domain admin level. So that one's pretty bad. But when we're talking about just elevating privileges in the local system, Microsoft generally considers these vulnerabilities as medium or even low. This means there's no out-of-cycle patch. For step 2 of the attacker's compromise, Microsoft considers these non-critical and releases them at the next month's Patch Tuesday cycle. And they've traditionally done this for years and years and years. From my perspective, server-side exploitation is becoming less and less common. Well, we like to say less and less common, but with things like Bluekeep and Eternal Blue and Apache struts, that may not be entirely accurate. But the number of those most certainly is fewer than what we see on the client-side perspective. So while it is important, absolutely, to mitigate the risks of all of these attack surface areas, when we have finite information security resources to perform this, we have to be very precise on what it is that we actually recommend. And server-side might just not be the name of the game 100% of the time. It's also important for us to understand how these exploits come about, as in what's the result of them. They might be denial of service or authentication bypass, or even remote code execution. If we're to say what the gold standard is of really bad, generally speaking, we're talking about remote code execution. This means an attacker can remotely gain access to your system and fully gain control of that system. And that's, of course, very obviously dangerous. But one of the things we talk about, well, in vulnerability assessment, but also specifically in 460, is what does it take to make a remote code execution vulnerability? And the answer to this is actually a bit multifaceted. Let's take a look at one of these here real quickly. Once we start to understand these details and concepts, being able to look at the actual vulnerability module that's returned from, say, a vulnerability scanner. In this case, this is output from Nexpose or Insight VM, that is a scanner by Rapid7. We can see interesting and important information. For example, this vulnerability presents remote code execution against Windows SMB. This means we do know, in fact, the port that's associated, that's affected, is port 445. It also gives us some of this criticality information. Okay, well, it's a 9, evidently, a risk score 919, and CVSS score, you can't quite see the 8 there, but that is 9.8. What does that mean? I'll tell you right now, the answer is nothing. It means very little to next to nothing. What is this system? Is it connected to a critical network? Is it the HMI for an ICS device? Does it control all of your HR data? Is there HIPAA information on it? The answer is we don't know. We have none of that information based on the severity score. So while CVSS is the common vulnerability scoring system and is very valuable in my opinion, it's not a risk score. So in this case, we see Rapid7 presenting a risk score on this vulnerability. Realize that that is not a risk score. They are wrong. So what are they right about though? And the answer is they're actually quite right about a fair number of things as well. It is remote code execution, and it exists in SMB, most specifically SMB v1. That's really useful information, and it allows an unauthenticated attacker to exploit the condition. Furthermore, if you look a little deeper, it also gives us information on where there might be exploits available for it in the wild. And in this case, we see that Eternal Blue has real exploits available in the Metasploit framework. All of these are really important things to derive, because when we actually end up calculating real risk for our organization, it's important to know the reality of these things. And our vulnerability scanning utility, well, it's completely wrong when it says something like risk, is very right about a lot of the things that we'll use to derive what our customized actual risk calculation is for our organization. Now let's counterpose this. A lot of folks don't know about a vulnerability that's commonly referred to as Eternal Red. Eternal Red is a vulnerability for Linux. It actually exists in Samba. Samba is the Linux equivalent of SMB. It happens to have the same style of implementation flaw as SMB does, hence the similar name. But it's also Linux, not Windows. This Windows vulnerability allows an unauthenticated attacker to exploit it. But why is it unauthenticated? And a lot of that has to do with the fact that for this exploit to work, you actually require write access to a Windows share, but Windows has many of these default ones built into it by default, IPC $, admin $, etc. Linux does not have this. And as a result, write access in Linux is non-trivial. It turns out, for whatever reason, I don't actually know the answer to this. It turns out, though, that the CVSS pre-computated score for Eternal Red is a 10 as opposed to the 9.8 for Eternal Blue. But it actually requires more and is harder to exploit Eternal Red than Eternal Blue. So what does this mean? It means we can't trust direct numeric output from a pre-computated computerized system. We need to go a little bit deeper. And there's this concept of cerebration over computation. And if we look at more explicit examples of this, things like Heartbleed. Heartbleed is a 5.0. What does that mean? And the answer isn't that it's wrong. It's very easy for us to look at that and go, no, there's no way that a 5.0 is accurate here. But that's simply not true. It's possible that Heartbleed is a 5.0. It's also possible that Heartbleed is a 0 or a 10. It depends on the environment, it depends on the system, and it even depends a little bit on the temporal considerations about what attackers are using in the wild on a day-to-day basis. So the answer is, pre-computation is simply inaccurate, and it's very easy for us to see this. Is this Heartbleed against a server that's as important as, say, Equifax? Or is it Heartbleed against something that is a default Apache system with zero actual information? In fact, maybe the developer just installed Apache but hasn't put anything on there yet. What do you get from Heartbleed? And the answer is nothing important. Another one that's really poignant here that I like to bring up all the time is CVE 2012-0152. This is similar to one that we're very familiar with these days, Bluekeep. In fact, this is an attack against remote desktop protocol that allows you to overwrite memory space and cause a denial of service condition via a blue screen of death. This is also exactly what Bluekeep does. Exactly what Bluekeep does. In fact, the first several exploits for Bluekeep that we found, that we had, they weren't remote code execution. They were blue screen of death denial of service. So what's the difference here? And honestly, a lot of that difference has to do with what the tooling is for an attacker. It's possible that something like address space layout randomization makes it impossible or extremely unlikely for a vulnerability to be successful, whereas another one that's similar is because of this. But at the end of the day, these conditions are very similar, which means, do we understand the vulnerability based on the advisory from the vendor? And more importantly, even, does the vendor understand the implications of that vulnerability too? So when we look at this, it becomes very obvious that we need to start performing some kind of manual calculation of risk that ascribes risk to our organization's considerations versus, well, what the community happens to think that the severity is for something. And we tend to do this kind of thing via two means, and they're qualitative and quantitative analysis. These aren't cybersecurity considerations. If you look at the intelligence community, they do this often, right? You might see, say, a clip in a movie where you've got a drone feed, and in that drone feed, someone's saying, we assess with a high degree of confidence that the high value target is in this convoy. Okay, got it. What does that mean? Well, let's take a couple words out of there. One of those words is assessment. Assessment isn't as simple as running a tool or using something to gather information and then using that and calling that an assessment. That's not what it is. What an assessment does is it takes multiple sources of data, grabs them together, performs some kind of confidence analysis on how valid that information is, analyzes it to perform it into actionable intelligence. And based on that intelligence information, we can assess a degree of risk, vulnerability, and confidence in the decision-making process. This is what an assessment is. And it's very obvious that our scanners, though they may say that they provide us level of risk, simply can't do this. This is the job of vulnerability assessors. And the mechanisms by which we perform these assessments are twofold. They're qualitative and quantitative. So when we have something like CVSS, and I know a lot of people dislike CVSS, let's take a look at that here in just a moment. But I personally quite like CVSS. I think it's really good. But don't forget, if it's qualitative and quantitative, CVSS being a quantitative analysis means a tool for this, that means it's never ever more than half of the equation. And if we're using some kind of pre-computated or computational based risk assessment means, we are always going to be missing at least half of the story. So in the case of CVSS, we've got CVSS version 2, CVSS version 3, now there's a 3.1 that's out there. 3 is, in my opinion, a superset of CVSS version 2. That's a bit of a oversimplification, but I do like all of the changes in CVSS v2, or excuse me, v3 over v2. Specifically, if we take a look at the actual calculation, and I think this is where people go wrong. When I hear people talk about CVSS, generally speaking, they're in one of two camps. Either camp A, CVSS is awesome. Camp B, CVSS sucks because it's obviously wrong all the time. Did you see Heartbleed? Okay, both camps are right. The other thing that's really similar between both of those two camps, neither of them have read the CVSS specification. And to be fair, I don't necessarily recommend you do. It's hundreds of pages long. There's a lot of data there. But if you've got a really strong opinion about CVSS and you haven't read it, what you're doing is you're taking information that's provided to you by external sources and you're trusting it. For example, if we go back to that Rapid7 risk score, I would assess that Rapid7 perhaps has a significant benefit that they can acquire by making CVSS look bad and their custom rating looking better than CVSS's. They're in it for sales. And for better or for worse, this is what capitalism looks like, right? But if we're trying to assess what the actual vulnerability space is for organization, we need to understand these tools. And in my opinion, as a quantitative assessment means, CVSS is a really good one. It also has 3 different styles of calculation associated with it. Here we have on the screen is actually just one of them, but it is, in my opinion, one of the most poignant. For example, since it's an environmentally specific scoring metric, how can a vulnerability scan database that has a CVSS score associated with a vulnerability know what's specific about your environment? The answer is they can't. And if we look at the different facets of this CVSS equation, we see that, right? What is the complexity of the attack? Well, in the case of Bluekeep, when there was no public exploit for it, it's probably low. And now that there is, well, it's liable to be pretty much the opposite, right? The attack complexity for Bluekeep has gone down now that more tooling actually exists for it. In the case of, say, something like Eternal Blue, this is even more poignant. There was a Metasploit exploit for Eternal Blue for Windows 7 and Windows 2008 R2 within a month or two of the actual release by the shadow brokers. It took another year and a half to have that level of tooling for Eternal Champion effects, Windows 10, Windows Server 2016. This means if we're trying to triage which one of these is more risky, which ones to patch first, there's some obvious differences here. And so when CVSS, as shown by the vulnerability database, doesn't reflect these considerations, it's obviously wrong, but that doesn't mean that CVSS is wrong. It just means we haven't looked at it, because turns out CVSS has a lot of stuff. Next example, privilege is required. Remember, Eternal Red versus Eternal Blue. Eternal Red requires authenticated access to a share. Somehow it has a higher CVSS score than Eternal Blue. It's because it wasn't calculated appropriately. And so if we look at our environments and we calculate things based on base modifiers, impact metrics, impact subscore modifiers, in the environmental score metrics alone, we can see a huge differential for our environment's CVSS score versus any others. So if we calculate these ourselves, we become much, much more accurate. And there's even things like temporal score metrics and some base score metrics for CVSS. We can get really fine-grained on what the actual score is. We might find that Heartbleed on a certain system in our environment is a 9, and CVSS tells us that. And we might find that in some other place in our environment, Heartbleed is a 0, and CVSS tells us that. It's when we use pre-computation over cerebration that we lack the ability to make those kind of considerations for ourselves. But let's not forget the second side of the coin here, qualitative assessment. One of the most poignant examples, or benefits, if you will, for qualitative assessment is that it allows us to look at our environment and make some kind of opinion-based identification of what the reality actually is there. Now, there's some downsides to qualitative assessment, and to be fair, there's some downsides for quantitative. Quantitative assessment tends not to be very good at ascribing itself to our actual environmental considerations. Qualitative assessment tends to be really good at that, but qualitative assessment tends to be very vulnerable to opinion-based variance by whoever the actual assessor is. So when we actually look at the tools, quantitative tools, qualitative tools, those tools are designed to limit those problems in each one of the assessment means. For example, the Internet Storm Center uses something called a risk rating rubric. The risk rating rubric used by the Internet Storm Center is referred to as Infocon. Infocon essentially takes a condition and it escalates what it rates that condition as or downgrades it based on a series of yes and no questions. This helps to eliminate bias in this style of assessment, which again, qualitative is particularly susceptible to. My recommendation for many organizations who are really, really lean, and by lean, I mean you don't have a lot of resourcing for your information security program. Well, if you don't have a lot of resources, what do? You can't do all of this. My recommendation in those cases is often hyperbole. And that means take quantitative, take qualitative, but take pieces of them so that you can get a lot of value in a small amount of time. For example, we like to call this the 80-20 rule, the Pareto principle, right? Where the first 20% of effort you put into something gives you 80% of that value back. So if you don't have the time to do customized risk assignments and assessment for individual vulnerabilities, put in the first 20% because you're going to get 80% of the value back. So let's say that you have 0 time, basically at all, and you can't even do customized CVSS scoring. Well, that's unfortunate. However, it's not the end all be all, because don't forget, we also have qualitative assessment means as a secondary facet for us. So what we could theoretically do is we could take pre-computated CVSS, which we know to be flawed. It's not the best, but it is something. It's better than taking all of our vulnerabilities, putting them in deck, and shuffling them and picking the first one off the top. It's got value. It's not the best value, but it's value. And if we take that and combine it with a second side of the story, something like qualitative, we can absolutely abstract even more value. In this case, should you use the InfoCon risk rating rubric? Absolutely not. The idea here is we can create yes and no questions based on what's most important for our organization. For example, let's say we are a hospital. Hospitals have some pretty direct concerns. We've got things like personal safety risk for our organization that's really important. And we also have things like compliance risk, maybe in the form of HIPAA, healthcare style data. Our organization may assess that the thing that they are most concerned about is HIPAA data and the exposure of that. Of course, you might go, oh my gosh, how can you care more about HIPAA data than personal safety? But the answer is our organization's tolerance of risk may go one way or the other. That's not actually a cybersecurity consideration. That's an organization's strategic business decision. In my opinion, should personal safety be higher? Probably. But my opinion in this case, right, is the information security expert's opinion. So what does the organization want to tolerate from a risk perspective is actually more valid here. At the end of the day, though, does the organization care about both? Yes, probably. So let's say we created 2 questions. And the questions were, does this system do and perform, say, surgery of some sort, surgical procedures? And the second question is, does this system carry healthcare information on it? And we say any vulnerability is +5 for the healthcare information, +4 for the personal safety risk, or flipped, depending on which your organization's actual risk focus is. So which one is entirely dependent on you. But here we now suddenly have a way to immediately split apart vulnerabilities where CVSS score no longer is the entirety, is no longer the crux of our assessment means. And we can do this with a tool as simple as Microsoft Excel. So taking the 2 sides of the equation, the 2 pieces of the story, and putting them together, even if we make a lot of assumptions and we do it poorly, is still really, really valuable. So if we have the resourcing and do it well, we can get extreme value off this. And more importantly, when we move to remediation, we can make sure that we maximize the value proposition of our finite remediation time. And this brings us to the vulnerability assessment framework. It's obvious now that this whole vulnerability scanning phase, which is in the middle of this framework, but essentially for many organizations forms the crux and 90% of their entire vulnerability assessment management program, we can see that this isn't enough. So what's a more structured approach to allow us to integrate things like information about what the threat actor is actually going to be triggering and focusing on, threat model, versus how can we focus on validating these vulnerabilities to eliminate things like false positives? I think validation is also an interesting one to consider. But let's take a look through the different pieces of the actual vulnerability assessment framework. It's broken into modules. And in VA, we actually have something of an advantage here over things like penetration test and red team. They tend to have to be a lot more flexible on their feet. Whereas from our perspective, many of the things that we need, they're required before we can enter into the next process. And this is why the framework is based on these inputs and outputs. Before we start identifying vulnerabilities, we need to have a target matrix in order to begin assessing or scanning and looking for vulnerabilities on. But the first thing we always need to consider is something like engagement planning. Engagement planning, people, process, technology, rules of engagement, scoping. This is important. And it's important for a lot of reasons that us technical folk often don't necessarily acknowledge. For example, is your vulnerability assessment program causing more risk to the organization than it's identifying and fixing? Let's say you're a hydroelectric dam. Did you just run your vulnerability scanner against the entire thing? And did you crash everything and break the dam? This is personal safety risk actualization via your assessment program, which is supposed to mitigate these risks. Of course, again, that's a hyperbolic example, but on the lower level, we have to think about these things too. For example, if it's just, say, 10 workstations, are they often being crashed by vulnerability assessment, and are we actually remediating these problems? If we're remediating nothing because we're not getting any corporate buy-in to have resources allocated to remediation, but we're scanning and we're bringing these systems down because, well, they're vulnerable, is the VA program actually creating more damage than it's actually fixing? And that's a really important consideration for us. The answer is going to vary, but we need to make sure that whatever time and effort we dedicate towards mitigating the opportunity for a negative event occurring, that it's valuable and that it's more valuable than not doing it at all. The next piece, and this one's often overlooked in vulnerability assessment, right? Because we're looking at the vulnerabilities, and the vulnerabilities matter. But the answer actually is, no, they don't. Vulnerabilities don't matter at all. Let's say, for example, we have a vulnerability like Spectre and Meltdown. We talked about this a little bit ago. Let's say that that vulnerability is only actually actionable, like only people who can actually affect that vulnerability and exploit it are of a high level of capability, which in Spectre and Meltdown's case, that's absolutely true. Let's say that there's nobody in our threat model who would be interested in engaging our organization who's at that level of capability. Let's say, for example, we're an ice cream parlor. Is the Russian nation state really in our threat model? And if the answer is no, then Spectre and Meltdown obviously should be below our risk tolerance. We shouldn't be spending a lot of time worrying about those. So, is it okay not to patch them? Absolutely. Don't patch. Don't patch because that's not in your threat model. And if nobody has the intent, the opportunity, or the capability to actually go after you with that specific condition, then it's of a much lower level of risk. And possibly we shouldn't patch it. And in a world where most enterprises, the most common password across the entire organization is password one, capital P and one, because complexity. Should we be patching Spectre and Meltdown? And the answer is one of these conditions has a CVSS score and the other one doesn't. And one of these conditions, an attacker will actually exploit, and the other, they likely won't. But they're opposite. And when we start assessing risk against vulnerabilities and actually building a proper assessment and management program, this is really where we want to focus on. And so threat modeling is obviously a direct requirement of a program like this, but oftentimes we overlook it. The next phase, of course, is going to be discovery. This one's really straightforward. If we don't know what's on our environment, but an attacker discovers it for us, that's not the best way to find out that we're vulnerable. That said, it's actually also a little bit overlooked because we look at discovery like, oh yeah, it's obvious. We need to find these things in order to find out what's vulnerable on them. But it goes deeper than that. It's not just your IP addresses that are available or that systems are running on. What about the names? Let's jump back to Equifax. Did Equifax vulnerability scan their system? The answer is yes, they absolutely did. They missed it. They didn't just miss it, so did the scanner. Why? It's because of discovery. Discovery isn't just about finding systems, it's also about discovery at the application level. You might have a web server that only delivers a certain web application based on the name of that application, which means we scan it, but what we're actually scanning is a default page, whereas the application, when scanned by name as opposed to IP address, may deliver a whole different subset of code. And if we haven't discovered that, and if we haven't tailored our tools to focus on those, we're going to miss things. Discovery is really important. And then the next step, of course, step 4, scanning. It's the one that we tend to actually associate with vulnerability, well, assessment. We often refer to it as vulnerability scanning. But we also make some mistakes here. For example, is Rapid7 and Qualys and Nessus, are they scanners that are really competent against web applications? If you ask your vendor, the answer is probably yes. They've got a financial incentive to say yes. To be fair, can they find web vulnerabilities? The answer is also yes. Are they really good at it? It's not in their core competency. They certainly have a value proposition, but a web application specific scanner, the organization that manufactures that one of those systems, their entire objective, right? It's one of those you had one job kind of things. And to be fair, something like Acunetics and AppScan and NetSparker, they have one job, and that job is web applications. I think it's pretty safe to assume that they do a better job of it than your general purpose scanners. And in the case of something like the Apache Struts vulnerability that affected Equifax, we can see it. In 460, we in fact have a lab where Nexpose misses that vulnerability and Acunetics finds it. When we start talking about tooling with scanning, we're often talking about becoming more and more specific to the application level because our tooling here does in fact matter. The next phase, and this is another one that's often overlooked, is validation. The reason this is often overlooked is because we think, hey, there's a lot of vulnerabilities in our environment, and if, like Equifax, there's a chance of us missing them, it's probably more important not to miss the vulnerability than to validate that it's accurate. But I think this is wrong for two reasons. The first one, of course, is, well, if we only have finite remediation resources and we're not validating these findings, we're wasting those resources. So validation is really valuable from us. From that same perspective, though, what if we present a bunch of findings to a system owner? And that system owner is running a web application. And one of these findings is that you have 77 different PHP vulnerabilities. And they look at our list and they say, you know, my web application is Ruby on Rails. This is obviously a false positive. Are they right? Yes, they are. Now, it's possible that the PHP modules have been installed on the system and they should probably be removed because they don't need to be there. It's additional attack surface. But there's a difference between vulnerability from attack surface and vulnerability because something's remote code execution. If we're assessing that this is a high because our scanner says that to us, but it's not actually directly accessible at all, the attacker has no opportunity to engage it, we're wrong, not our system owner. And so if we present these findings to us and they can obviously see that, we start to damage those relationships, and that's dangerous. But the second piece of validation is that with validation, we actually ascribe a couple additional things. We're not just validating is it a false positive or not, we're also able to assign information about how confident we are in whether it is true or not. And one further step, when we validate a vulnerability, we're also able to validate if the risk is accurate. For example, let's say that we have anonymous FTP. Will Nexpose find this general purpose scanner? Yes, it will. It calls it a CVSS score 0. Is it wrong? No, it's not. Anonymous FTP is a feature. Is it a good feature? I would call it a pretty risky feature. But the real question is, what's there? So when we validate this, we log into it. We check what access you have. Do you have read access? Do you have write access? Oh, it's a PHP web server and we have write access to the system via anonymous FTP. What is that? We validated it's not a CVSS 0. We validated it as a remote code execution vulnerability. Because if we can upload PHP code, we can gain full access to that server if you're an attacker. This means that 0 is irrelevant, but we would never know that if we hadn't validated some of that vulnerability space. And upon validation, we can identify that it most certainly isn't the same as what we thought. Is it true positive? Yes, we validated that it is in fact a true positive. It's not a false negative or false positive. We also validated that the vulnerability risk rating was not accurate, and we're able to just based off of that. And finally, remediation. We talk about remediation oftentimes. What we're really talking about is the fixing of the problem. But when we talk about remediation from the perspective of vulnerability assessment, that's not it. We in VA are often not the system owner or the organization, the group with the permissions to be able to make a change action on this, right? We're not the people who are pushing the patches. So when we talk about remediation in the context of VA, we're not talking about pushing the fix. What we're talking about is what does the information security expert, as part of this process, have the ability to provide as input. For example, if we said, hey, IT, here's a couple vulnerabilities. Well, what are they going to do? They're experts on the availability and configuration of the system. which means they're going to go to the system owner and they're going to apply the patch from the system owner. Things like Microsoft says patch, and here's the patch, apply that patch. That might be a good fix. But what about other fixes? What about full force multipliers that can allow us to fix more than one thing at once? For example, MS17010. It's an exploit for SMBv1. There's another exploit for SMBv1 that's really bad. It's the one the configure worm used in 2008. So in 2008, if we had applied the vendor patch or presented a compensating control where we disable SMBv1, which one would have been the most effective in 2008? And the answer is they're both effective in 2008. Which one's the most effective in 2017? If we disable SMBv1 in 2008 to patch MS08067, we would also have accidentally patched MS17010. And so when we talk about remediation, understanding what our vulnerability scanner's output is and what it means, and what kind of compensating controls exist that we can put in place, we can often cause extreme levels of remediation, where that remediation itself fixes the problem today, but also fixes many potential problems in the future. These compensating controls are often mitigations that exceed our patches. So maybe the answer is don't patch, because a mitigation may be better. And it's important to recognize that all a patch is a mitigation. But our IT administrators and our system administrators and our system owners won't know this because they don't come from a security background. In vulnerability assessment, we have the opportunity to provide that expertise. And in remediation, we have the opportunity to do so. Finally, reporting. Reporting is how we integrate into these enterprise processes for performing things like remediation. This reporting set of features is going to differ wildly depending on what kind of service you provide. Let's say that you are a third-party vulnerability assessor. Your reporting structure is going to look very, very different than if you're an internal vulnerability assessment and management program. So however we can tie into these processes is the real value proposition here. So you have to think about things like ticketing systems. We have to think about things like what will an IT administrator actually read versus will they not? One of my biggest recommendations tends to be the executive summary for both third parties and internal organizations. In that executive summary, you may have the opportunity to say something like, here's a really bad vulnerability. It caused a vulnerability space to exist for, say, hospitals out of the United Kingdom via the WannaCry worm, causing X million dollars of damage on average between these different organizations. Does that tell us anything about how to fix the problem? It doesn't, but it does tell executives exactly about how bad it actually is. I personally like to use executive summaries as a pointer to the findings and the methodology of reporting procedures. Because if the report's exec sum looks like that, IT is going to feel like their boss is going to ask them questions about it. So they probably need to know those answers. And they'll read the findings and the methodology in order to be able to do that. Now again, 460 is just one course amongst many inside of SANS. That said, I do think that vulnerability assessment is one of the most important things that we need to do in information security. And the course itself actually exists to be able to capitalize on that need. We're going to be doing a lot more of these webcasts throughout the year because I think it's actually really important to get a real fine-grained identification on what these problems might be. So whereas today's, I think, kind of sets the stage for what a vulnerability assessment and management program ought to be and what it ought to entail, it's also important to realize there's more to this, and how do we perform more detailed risk assessment? How do we identify and how do we perform these threat modeling things? How do we audit our Windows Active Directory domains, which is where an attacker will generally live during their compromise? So how do we prevent many of the attack surface areas that they'll leverage? And throughout the year, we're going to be doing quite a few of these different webcasts. At least every month we'll have one, maybe two, on talking more through some of these pieces, because I think it's really important for many organizations. If you're looking for additional content on this space, though, there's also a YouTube channel that you can leverage. For example, one of the most recent YouTube channels here is actually a review of the FlanScan tool. FlanScan is a vulnerability scanner by CloudStrike. It is, or Cloudflare, excuse me, completely different companies. It is completely open source and free, and it extends Nmap via the vulner script and allows for things like customized reporting and such. So if you're looking for additional content, additional information on this, in the now, this YouTube channel is really, really useful for that perspective. But we'll also be performing multiple different webcasts throughout the year as well to continue to give more value to the community on something we think to be very vital. In any case, and without further ado, I'm going to turn it back over, and we'll see if there are any questions.
All right, thanks for that great presentation. We haven't had any questions submitted so far, but maybe while we give people a chance to think about it, I'd like to remind them you can find your CEUs for all completed webcasts by logging into your SANS portal account, navigate to your account dashboard, then click My Webcasts. You can then download your CEU on the right-hand side of the web page. As someone has said, great presentation. All right, well, maybe we just give people another minute or so. Please note that a copy of the slides and recording of this webcast will be available for viewing later today and can be found on the SANS registration page. Well, Matthew, I'm not seeing anything come in. Do you have any closing thoughts, or should I wrap it up?
I think we're good to wrap it up. Again, we're going to be doing a lot more of these webcasts throughout the year. It's the holiday season, so have a really good time, be safe, and enjoy time with family.
Yes, and thank you all for listening to the last SANS webcast of 2019. Thank you so much, Matthew, for your great presentation, which helps bring this content to the SANS community. To our audience, we greatly appreciate you listening in. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, please visit sans.org/webcasts. Until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast.